people say we don't understand the mechanism for electromagnetic field effects. Well, we have no real clue on the cause of Alzheimer's disease. I gave a lecture on Alzheimer's disease to Albany medical students on Wednesday this week. We have a lot of information, but we don't know what causes Alzheimer's disease. So Kathy asked me to talk a little bit about electrohypersensitivity. This is a controversial area. It's an area where I was really quite skeptical until probably 10 years ago that this was a real disease. There are some people who, in the presence of radio frequency fields or even 60 hertz power line fields, suffer headaches, dizziness, a general feeling of ill health, often weakness. Some people are so severely incapacitated that they barely can leave their house. They cannot go to public places. You can't go into a McDonald's or a Starbucks without being in a Wi-Fi environment. And extremely sensitive people cannot go to those places. This is one of the reasons why we've asked that all cell phones be turned off in this room tonight, because there are people here that are electrically sensitive. I get calls from these people all the time. Now, of the studies that have been done, many of them report that electrosensitive people, if you take them into the laboratory, can't tell whether there are fields on or not. And therefore, most physicians send these people to psychiatrists and say it's all in your head. But there are other studies that have taken people that report that they are electrosensitive and take them into the laboratory, and about half of them they respond with symptoms when they're in the presence of fields. One of the best studies was with a female physician who was taken into a very high-tech neurology laboratory in Louisiana, and when she was exposed to fields, she got headaches. When the fields were not on, she didn't have a headache. So this is a real syndrome. It still is controversial. We don't know the mechanism of it. This is something I've gotten very interested in because it's very similar to other syndromes that are called medically unexplained symptoms. Fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, multiple chemical sensitivity. I have a project on Gulf War illness. The veterans of the 1990-1991 Gulf War have these syndromes of chronic pain, headaches, mental brain fog, they say. Their brain their cognitive function doesn't work as well. So these are areas that need a lot more attention, a lot more study. It is a real disease. We don't know exactly what it is caused by, but we know that there are people that are severely disabled because of this disease. Now, I'm concerned again that if we have Wi-Fi in school classrooms where children are exposed to high-intensity radio frequency fields for long periods of time, a certain number of those children are going to develop this syndrome that's going to be incapacitating for the rest of their life.
Thank you, Dr. Carpenter. Dr. Blank, I'd like to give you a chance to respond to some of the other presentations, and also ask you, if you would, while you're doing that, maybe talk a little bit, if you can, about dirty electricity, and whether your claim that if we could cable instead of Wi-Fi, that we would reduce the EMF, but would we be really taking risk down to zero or down considerably if we're not dealing with electrical currents?
But let me first add something to what Dr. Carpenter said in terms of the electrohypersensitivity. One of the poster the poster people for the electrohypersensitivity is Gro Brundtland, the former head of the WHO office that dealt with these health problems, former Prime Minister of Norway. She developed this electrohypersensitivity as a result of some exposure, an optical exposure, something as a result of chemicals. But anyway, everybody in that office knew that she could detect when a cell phone was being used. And there's no question about her. She actually eventually gave up the job because of I assume because of their inability to function that way. But you can say some people are making these things up, but someone with that, public exposure and that kind of reputation is pretty hard to refute. She was a real genuine case. And I think that the the electrical hypersensitivity has been done very well, very demonstrated. That doctor in Texas, is his name Ria? Dr. Ria from is it Dallas? What's that?
William Ray, he worked with multiple chemical sensitivity people.
Dr. Ray, yes.
Yeah, okay. So those studies are certainly have held up, and people, people point to them as being studies that could remove a lot of doubts. Now, in terms of commenting, you wanted me to speak specifically about dirty electricity. There isn't much one can say in terms of our electrical supply comes from powerhouses where they send out nice clean signals, sort of, and then we take them into our homes and we use them in circuits which connect them to all kinds of other devices. The result of this, these other devices kind of churn this electricity, they use the power, and then they somehow generate different frequencies of their own. And the result is that this ends up going onto the line. And when you get 60 hertz power from the power company, instead of getting this nice smooth sine wave, which we all see in physics textbooks, the fact of the matter is it's got this overlay of all kinds of frequencies on it, even though you've got the sine wave on it. And this is the stuff that is supposedly very harmful, because studies that have been done by Sam Millen, who is an engineer epidemiologist, or I guess he's an epidemiologist who's done a lot of this. I remember seeing him at meetings of the Bioelectromagnetic Society, walking around checking the various outlets in the rooms that we were using. He never stopped working. And he's got a book called Dirty Electricity, where he points out that this thing is really a real problem, and people can be affected by it. So it's really something that is a result of using these devices in a real world. In other words, there are also problems that come from improper grounding. In order to prevent shock, we ground a lot of electrical equipment so that we take all this extra power and protect ourselves by having it connected to the ground, which is a good sink in case you get a surge of some kind of electricity. Well, the result is that the ground gets polluted, in effect. So most ground is bad. Now, people tell you that grounding is great, walking with bare feet on the ground. It depends on which ground you're walking on. Some grounds are just pretty bad. They are in some cases even dangerous to walk on. So there was an article recently online published by Dr. Furstenberg, who is an electrohypersensitive case that is really a fascinating tragedy. He was a medical student who was, I think it is, going into his third year, doing very well. And when he got into the operating rooms with all this electronic equipment, he suddenly couldn't function. Enormous headaches, and he had to drop out of medical school. And he now lives in Santa Fe and publishes a newsletter and information on this problem. But it's a personal tragedy. Some people reach this stage where they can really not function in society the way it's constructed. Now, there are ways that people will sell devices that one can put into the outlets to eliminate minimize this dirty electricity, and that usually helps. You know, it's hit and miss. I don't know if that's, well, then I'll pass the baton to the next runner.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Blank. Dr. Paulagloria, give you a chance to respond again, and also ask you, you talked about the chart in which you were looking at the incidence of leukemia, AML, in children at 5 years old, and what you would need to see a rise in background. But you wouldn't actually be able to see the increase if you were always looking at 5-year-olds, right? If we're talking about latency periods. So I'd like you to maybe address the question of latency for the various measures that we're looking at, and how that can make it more difficult to parse things.
Yeah, when we do an epidemiology kind of study, much of the exposures have already taken place, and so we have to reconstruct exposure. Occasionally, an epidemiologist will do what's called a prospective study, where they begin today and start looking forward. And it's easy then because you can take the measurements now while they're happening and then wait to see what occurs because of that. Difficulty is those tend to be really expensive experiments because they have to be conducted over a long period of time. So you have to have a staff and all of this other stuff that goes with it. Whereas taking a person who has a disease and trying to reconstruct what their exposure was, and that's called a retrospective exposure study. That's much less expensive to do because you sit the person down and say, okay, we're going to go over what it is you've been exposed to. Tell me all of your magnetic field exposures. That's the problem. It's difficult, even if you know what you're being exposed to. In certain, if I asked you what all of your hydrogen sulfide exposures were, hydrogen sulfide smells like rotten eggs. And in fact, Dr. Carpenter just did a study of hydrogen sulfide exposures, so it's really good. But you'll remember hydrogen sulfide exposures. But the question is, if I ask you, were you exposed to hydrogen sulfide on December 10th, 1981? You'll go, what day of the week was that? And so trying to reconstruct that over some period of time, particularly if you're a 5 to 9 year old and your parents may not know exactly what you were doing during the day. When I was 5 years old, I stuck a magnet in an electrical socket and got a real electrical field exposure. That's the only one I remember. And so you have that constant difficulty in trying to do dose reconstruction, as we call it. And you'll get a lot of skepticism over how well you've done it, how well you've reconstructed it, and what biases you had in asking the questions. Are you leading the witness, so to speak, in saying, oh yeah, I play with magnets, putting them in electrical sockets every single day. Well, of course you didn't. You wouldn't be sitting here if you did. But it's part of what we do as epidemiologists, and it can be difficult. And the results that you can end up getting from that are not quite as good as if you had a test tube and you knew exactly what you put in the test tube. And so you end up with correlations of things that aren't maybe quite as well measured as they could be.
Thank you. What I want to do is move to the phase where we invite the community more fully into the conversation. Before I do that, I want to give Dr. Carpenter a chance to put another thought.
Well, I think what Michael has described would be an ideal study, but that's not the way research is done in electromagnetic fields. But it does make the point that our exposure assessment is inadequate. Almost all studies, whether with power lines or with cell phones, look at people with the disease, whether that be brain cancer or leukemia, and look at people that don't have the disease. They're matched for age and sex and socioeconomic status. And then you ask the question, does the house you live in have high magnetic fields from the power line? Or how much cell phone usage did you have over the last 10 years as compared to people that don't have a cell phone? So the point that I would like to make is we know this is inadequate exposure. When you look at residents, you don't consider what happens at school, what happens when you go play somewhere. You're only dealing with one source of exposure. When you ask, do you use your cell phone, you're not considering all these other exposures. Yet those studies show statistically significant relationships. My point is because the exposure assessment is incomplete, those are going to dramatically underestimate the true risk. And that's why, as a public health official, I feel so strongly that this is a definite risk factor, but I don't know how great it is because nobody is unexposed. And the studies we do only identify one source of exposure in almost every study. So we're underestimating how bad this is.
Excellent. Can I ask if you want to ask a question to come to the microphone or give your card to somebody to come to the microphone for you?
There are people who, I'm not sure if they're electrosensitive. That's a serious problem because they are suffering. And the suffering is, for instance, one person will not come into the library because of Wi-Fi. So knowing how a person's electrosensitivity, Dr. Rubin has studied 65 different studies in Europe, double-blind. A double-blind study is where the investigator or the person there and the subject does not know what a device is on or off. In the 65 different studies from Sweden all over Europe, there has been no effect that they could say that people could tell the difference. They do say they're still not sure. Yeah. Okay. What? There's actually two questions, I'm sorry, because the other one I think is very important. How would you go ahead and determine if someone is electrosensitive? Here's another one. The bioinitiative report that two of you are involved with has an exposure standard of no more than 0.1 microwatts per square centimeter. That's the one you'd like to have. I have both NARDA and Holiday expensive RF meters which are sent away periodically to be calibrated. I have measured the fields of Wi-Fi routers and computers serviced and the fields in the space between them. With the Wi-Fi router and computers on, both the surface of the computers and the routers measured a maximum of 0.17, same units. The entire region between these two was less than 0.024 microwatts per square centimeter, extremely low. I turned off the router. The router no longer had any RF. Same thing in the immediate area. I don't know if the 0.02 is correct. The computer still had the 0.7. So you're going and wiring these computers. The computer is producing Wi-Fi. Yes, the question is, do you have any comments on this? Mark?
No, I was going to defer to you. No, I'm no engineer, and my comments would not be. I think all I can say is that the standards that were quoted by at the bioinitiative report were put down as a reasonable standard based on the scientific evidence that is contained within the report. It was not endorsed by everybody, but everybody wasn't polled to see what they actually found. I think that the important thing is that it was much lower than the standards that have been that have been given by the authorities. And I think that's the main point to carry away, that the standards set in the bioinitiative report have been set by the scientists who have been suggested, not set, they've been suggested by the scientists who've done the experiments, had a chance to assess the meaning of those levels, and have made that as a recommendation.
And I would only add to that those levels were identified as exposures in either humans, animals, or cells that did result in a clear adverse health effect. I think none of us felt that they were realistic to set as regulatory standards. But the point that they are thousands of times lower than what our federal and international standards are is an indication of how great the gap is between what those of us that work in this field feel is a level that is associated with adverse health risks, and the standards that are set by, in our case, the Federal Communications Commission and other federal and international agencies. Different in Europe.
The follow-on question is it different in Europe?
There are different standards in almost every country in the world. None of them, in my judgment, are protective of human health.
Another question?
Hi, my name is Steve Romine. I'm from Woodstock, and I used to be from West Virginia. My question is specifically for Dr. McCauley, because I know that Dr. Blank and Dr. Carpenter would agree with me on this. Don't you think that wireless devices should be proven safe biologically before they are deployed to the public, in light of the fact that no biological tests were done prior to them being made available?
What you're citing is basically what we call the precautionary principle. And adoption of the precautionary principle is kind of a societal thing. We have to get people to decide what they want. And that's where the discussion comes in about these. And so you've heard the evidence on both sides. I've tried to represent it as well as I could. And now you have to say, do we follow the precautionary principle and say, it has to be proven safe before it's used. That's the precautionary principle. Remember that if you want to do that, the precautionary principle can be applied to all sorts of things, some of which you may not be too happy about. Okay. The precautionary principle could be applied to traffic in town, right? If you've got traffic coming through town, that's a hazard, and it's a known hazard. And we know really well what the chances of being struck in traffic are. So, what is safe? How do you prove it's safe? And what's the benefit of that safety? Do you stop all traffic coming through town, for example? Maybe you should, and maybe you feel like you should. But it becomes a question of a social discourse at that point. It's saying, what do we adopt, and what do we feel we should adopt? And if you go back to public risk perception in that one handout page and look at all the things that influence public risk perception, I think you'll have a better understanding of your neighbors, maybe even of yourself, for wanting that level of protection. But it's, in a sense, it's not something that I can answer for you. The only thing I can do is to promote the discourse here.
Can I speak to that?
Please.
The precautionary principle really doesn't apply in this case. The precautionary principle says that if you want to do something in society, you have to measure the cost of preventing this damage to the anticipated cost of the damage that will be done. In other words, it's basically an economic decision. I think a better parallel is the introduction of drugs, for example. Before a drug is introduced to the public, the company that is making that drug has to test it and indicate that it's safe, that it cannot be used and cause damage. And I think that's what's really missing. We don't have to worry about the devices that may be. The point is, one should not introduce new devices in there that have the potential to cause big damage. And that's already been shown. And yet they just keep on going more devices at higher and higher energies.
Thank you. Raji?
Hi, my name is Raji Nevin, and I live here in Woodstock, New York. And first of all, I just want to say that I've done a lot of research on this issue over the past 1.5 to 2 years due to my own personal experience of being exposed to a smart meter on the other side of my bed where I was sleeping, and I got very ill. I never had any problems with electrosensitivity until that time, and now I definitely do, and it's not all in my mind. I wish it was. Secondly, I'd like to say I just want to advise, or not advise, but suggest, highly recommend to people that if you've not already read Dr. Martin's book, Overpowered, to please do so. It's one of the best books that I've ever read on this subject. It's very well-rounded, it's informational, and it's very easy to understand. I can't recommend it highly enough. Next, my question, which is for either Dr. Blank or Dr. Carpenter. Have you heard about the studies linking autism to EMF by Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt, and how he claims that he has personally taken away all exposure of children that he works with of EMF, in other words, taking them out of those environments 100%, which is difficult, but he's done it. And he claims that he's completely cured these children. And he works exclusively with autistic children and chronically ill patients. And he also claims that there is a definite correlation to the rise in EMF in the environment and autistic children, and that the correlation is the same. So my question is, do either of you have any information about the relation between autism in children and EMF?
If I can answer that first, I think there is absolutely no convincing evidence for any relationship between EMF and autism. And I think the few people that have been writing reports based on the increased use of cell phones following the increased risk of autism are doing a disservice to the whole study, because they do not have evidence that anything related to EMF is causing autism. And I specifically, that study, as well as the chapter which I objected to in the most recent bioinitiative report, the 2012 issue. I think this is not evidence, it's hypothesis. Hypotheses are fine, but they should not be presented as evidence. I don't see any relationship between any documented association between EMF and autism. That's not to say there isn't one. What I'm saying is the studies done today are hypotheses that do not present evidence. And I really regret those studies getting the publicity they do. Autism is a terrible disease. Nobody has a clue what autism is due to. But
vaccinations. Vaccinations.
There are many things. Let's not go there. There are a lot of things.
Dr. Blank, did you want to comment on this?
Well, the Klinghardt studies are very, very small, and that's always been a criticism of studies that reach global or rather large conclusions with relatively few data. But I think that there is mounting evidence about the involvement of autism. I think that the Lee study, where he was following up the women who were exposed in pregnancy, and I think the fact that you have this kind of carryover, the sins of the fathers are visited upon the children, this kind of thing is, it's shocking when you think that even in the safety of the womb, of the uterus, the children are still subjected to these influences. It's not only the children that are going to school that are being subjected to the Wi-Fi, but all these other influences that are occurring while the mother is carrying this developing fetus during the 9 months. So I think that while one may object to individual studies as not being strong enough to prove anything, I think there's enough caution, especially I found that the study which I showed you with the results in Iceland, where the mutation rate and the rate of autism, schizophrenia, correlated with the mutations of the father in the father's genome, but not with the mother, which indicates that the males are being subjected to this kind of genetic damage as they live and they go about their ordinary lives. And I think that we should be open to this possibility. While individual studies may not be strong enough to back up the assertions that are made, they certainly are calls for alertness and for caution.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Manajo Green. I'm the Environmental Director for Hudson River Sloop Clearwater. I've had the privilege of working with Dr. Carpenter on the volatilization of PCBs from the Hudson River and its sediments. New York State is undergoing thank goodness, is undergoing a process, a legal proceeding. The Public Service Commission is holding a proceeding called Reforming the Energy Vision in New York. And locally, Central Hudson is now allowing people to opt out of smart meters. So my questions are, how much better or safer are the alternative meters that they're using if people want to opt out of the so-called smart meters? And can we have a smart grid without smart meters?
Well, I think we can have smart meters that are not wireless. And that's really the central issue. Smart meters are very complicated. They give very high intensity but very brief pulses. We talked a little bit about dirty electricity. One of the issues that is a major problem is we don't really have a good understanding of what characteristics of these waveforms are the most dangerous. The dirty electricity concept is that even with the 60 hertz signals, there's RF on top of it. They're transients and so forth. Smart meters, as they operate, give these enormous, brief but very high intense signals. And there is some evidence, it's not convincing, but there's some evidence that it's that rapid rise to very high levels that's causing the symptoms that are being seen in people. And again, this is more anecdotal. It hasn't been well studied, but there are a number of people that report electrohypersensitivity from smart meters. The whole syndrome of headaches and mental fatigue and that sort of thing. I'm not an engineer, so I can't tell you how to do it properly. But I do know that if it's used in a wireless fashion, you're going to increase exposure, and that this is an unusual waveform that probably has more hazard than the usual sine wave.
Thank you.
Anyone else on that? In regard to the smart grid and smart meters, there's a very good monograph of about 50 pages called Getting Smarter About the Smart Grid. And the argument in the monograph is that smart grids operate at a level where we need aggregation of information. You don't need the individual precise information that you get from a smart meter. So there is no need to have smart meters in order to have a smart grid. And I refer you to that publication.
Hi, thank you. My name is Brett Berry, and I live in Chichester near Phoenicia. And I have many more questions than I came in with, but I'll try to focus it back to kids in schools. So there's a suggestion made that a school with Wi-Fi that is using that Wi-Fi for all of the student computers is worse than a school with Wi-Fi where those computers are hooked in with cables. So I'm just curious with Wi-Fi, with cell phones and everything else, a lot of times we don't have a lot of control over what we're exposed to, but how important are the devices in that equation as opposed to the signal that's coming out of the antennas?
If I understand your question correctly, it's a wired computer versus a wireless computer?
There was a mention that a school that has Wi-Fi capabilities and all the kids in that classroom, they're kind of creating this bubble of electromagnetic radiation because they're all using computers on that Wi-Fi network, whereas the school could have Wi-Fi, but if those computers are hardwired, it's a much less of a level of exposure for the kids, so that schools could have Wi-Fi, but not necessarily use it for everything. So I'm just curious, in that circumstance, devices versus having Wi-Fi, or devices versus having a cell signal, how does it weigh out?
Well, if all the computers are wired, then there's no purpose in having Wi-Fi. If there is Wi-Fi, and many of us have Wi-Fi in our homes. I do, my wife insisted. But, the river is way away from any place where we spend any time. Having Wi-Fi in your home, in the school, independent of how often it's used, is going to increase your radio frequency exposure to a small degree. If you concentrate many laptop computers all acting on Wi-Fi, then you're going to have much higher levels. So, you know, Michael is right. This is a risk versus benefit consideration. There's the benefit of the convenience of not having to have the wired cable versus the risk that some increment of radio frequency exposure, and it is only an increment because there are multiple sources, that increment is going to cause significant increased risk of cognitive dysfunction in school, cancer later on in life. And my only point is that I think a logical person, a logical school administrator, is going to do what they can to still provide access to the internet, still provide appropriate instruction for their kids, and at the same time do what they can do at not any great difference in cost to reduce their exposure to something that causes harm.
Thank you.
Could I just add, the whole Wi-Fi business, most people will have Wi-Fi, who have them in their homes, don't bother to shut them off at night. There's absolutely no reason why they don't shut them off. It's the same reason you can power off your pocket. I mean, instead of putting it in your pocket and you power it off, carry it around. You won't be getting a signal. When you're carrying your cell phone with you, the tower is checking where it is so it can send you a call when it comes into you. So it's constantly communicating. And the Wi-Fi has that same ability of being on all the time. People don't realize these things are on. If you realize these things are on, you don't want them on. And that's the problem with Wi-Fi in school. If you get it, you Wi-Fi the whole school. And you keep it on all the time. And you have to worry. You should really have it so that you use it in the specific areas where you want it, and then shut it off when it's not being used.
Charles Devin, Fort Roberts Falls, New York. Dr. Carpenter, you mentioned the evidence of brain cancer from cell phones, and I didn't catch exactly what studies you were referring to or where I could find this hard evidence. Would it be in the bioinitiative report, for example?
Well, most of the references are in the bioinitiative report. I think I would point to two particular studies. The Interphone report, which was published a couple of years ago, was a World Health Organization plus cell phone company study done in multiple countries around the world. And it was very interesting because if you would read the main text of that report, you would say there's no problem. But if you read the supplemental online material, there they show clearly that the more hours you use your cell phone, the greater your risk of brain cancer, that using a cell phone for 10 years or more increases the risk of brain cancer, that it's only on the side of the head you use the cell phone, and so forth. The larger number of publications have come from the laboratory of Leonard Hardell in Sweden. He has a very recent review article out. He's showing really very consistent, statistically significant elevated risks of brain cancer in the Swedish population in relation to duration of use. The elevated risks are sort of between 2- and 4-fold, which isn't that everyone that uses a cell phone is going to get brain cancer, but it's a statistically significant elevated risk.
Okay, that's Hardell and the World Health Organization then?
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
And the bioinitiative report certainly has those references, the 2012 version.
Hi, my name is Karen Charman, and I live in Shandaken, New York. When I was listening to Dr. Macaulay's description of what actually constitutes scientific proof for harm for an environmental exposure, it really struck me why it's almost impossible to actually prove that there is any harm from any given environmental exposure, whether you're talking about Wi-Fi or pesticide exposure or any number of things. So what I would like to suggest is instead of just looking at these issues individually, nobody is exposed to just one thing. We're exposed to a sea of things, all kinds of different contaminants. And I think that when we as a society start looking at it more in the aggregate, it will be more helpful to us to figure out like whether something is actually harmful or not. So I just wanted you guys to comment on that.
Yeah, let me start. That's a really, really good idea. It's really, really difficult to do. And on behalf of science, I apologize to you. I sincerely apologize to you because you are exactly right. That's what should be done, that we should be looking kind of at life, the universe and everything on these things, and we can't. And what happens is you get these things being broken down. And you're also right on the money when you talk about Hill's criteria. I mean, every epidemiologist worth of salt will quote Hill's criteria to you when they talk about causation. And it takes years. I started on a study of diesel exhaust and cancer and the association between the two in 1983, I believe it was. This past summer, the International Agency on Research in Cancer just declared diesel exhaust a carcinogen. That's how long it took.
But that also shows that the tools that science uses, which it then makes these statements that something is or is not safe, they're not adequate.
No, they're not adequate. They're not adequate. And as a scientist, I'm faced every day with how do I get funding? That's what we're beset by in trying to do science. It's not easy, and it's competitive, and the scientists' jobs rely on them getting funding. So they have to chase the disease of the weak. So even if they want to do electromagnetic fields, if they can't get funding for that, they can't keep their jobs in many cases.
So then science is not serving the society?
Yeah.
I'm a little concerned that some of the things that were said on the panel might leave people with the wrong impression. For example, that they might think that they're more likely to get hit by traffic in the center of Woodstock than to get sick from Wi-Fi. And I think one of the things that's also been lost is that and people perhaps don't understand just the magnitude of how much radiation Wi-Fi is exposing people to. There's a number of cell tower studies that showed upwards of 10% of people having symptoms of electrosensitivity at levels that are less than what people are getting in a Wi-Fi classroom. To that other person's comment, yeah, there are some schools that I've talked to that have passive Wi-Fi transmitters for the administration where the kids are using hardwired computers, but the amount of radiation in that classroom is still more than if they were picnicking at the base of a cell tower, which is contraindicated by the CPUC as of 1993. So I'd like to hear just some discussion about some of these cell tower studies and talk about them in context so people understand that Wi-Fi is exposing their children to more than a cell tower. And back to the electrosensitivity issue, there was a meeting of the European Social and Economic Committee last week. It's a consultative body of the EU that says it's now 3 to 5% of the population. That's a public health problem. I counted 5 people in this room that I know of that have electrohypersensitivity. That's a lot of people. Perhaps there are 250 people in here. And perhaps people with electrosensitivity were interested in coming to this forum, so it's not a representative number. But I think that's something that has to be taken into consideration. So I would like to hear about the cell tower studies, and I just want to read a quote from ICNIRP, which is the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection. They had a quote in a report in 2002. It's interesting because it's a body whose members have taken money from industry. And they say, different groups in a population may have differences in their ability to tolerate a particular non-ionizing radiation exposure. For example, children, the elderly, and some chronically ill people might have a lower tolerance to one or more forms of NIR than the rest of the population. Under such circumstances, it may be useful or necessary to develop separate guideline levels for different groups, but it may be more effective to adjust the guidelines for the general population. Some guidelines may still not provide adequate protection for certain sensitive individuals, nor for normal individuals exposed concomitantly to other agents, which may exacerbate the effect of NIR exposure. where such exposures have been identified, appropriate specific advice should be developed within the context of scientific knowledge. So my question for all the panelists is, in what universe, what other substance or agent do we ubiquitously expose the population to and say, oh, it's only dangerous for children, adults, and some chronically ill people and not a problem for everyone? And also, I'd like you to comment on the fact, if someone's ubiquitously exposed, then they're going to be chronically ill, and certainly we know from electrosensitive people that when they're away from the agent, they're not chronically ill.
Let me start off by correcting something. When I talked about the risk of being hit in traffic, I was talking about the precautionary principle. Not that it's necessarily a higher risk than suffering something from electromagnetic fields. It's just, it is risk. And we have to deal with all sorts of risks on a daily basis. And we have ways of, as a society, of dealing with that. And we're going to try to apply those same principles here with electromagnetic fields.
Hi, my name is Marge Roberts. I live in Barrytown, New York, founder of Hudson Artists. And I have a Wi-Fi in my home, and I observed that down the hall in the next room, where I had an iPad, it charged itself without being plugged in. Wow. And I thought that was very odd. I'd like to hear what that means, if anything, if that is statistically significant. And if I turn off my battery, what about my wireless laptop and my iPad? Do I disconnect? Well, I can't disconnect them. They'll still run. But what's the best way to turn those off? I think I'm being deluged with Wi-Fi stuff.
Don't tell Apple.
Don't tell Apple. No, but
this is a widespread complaint.
From, like 38, it'll charge up to 100%. It's not plugged in. It's sitting there. Wow. I thought very odd.
That would actually have to be a magnetic field. And it goes back to one of the things that I mentioned before. Although we're talking about electromagnetic fields, you have to understand that a lot of the literature really is focused on magnetic and not the electrical. And I think there may be more there than that. And we've got to make more measurements, and we've got to get a better feel for our electrical field exposures besides the magnetic field.
Dr. Blank, would you recommend those devices that can reduce dirty electricity for protecting this house? Would that have any role?
Well, I have no experience with it. The people who use them claim that it does. And there have been a few reports that suggest that maybe they don't always work as well as they should. So that's like with any device.
Okay, thank you, panel, for being a panel. And Carillion photography will measure the fields on the body. Maybe that would be useful in detecting any changes. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Daphne Tachovel. I'm an attorney, and I submitted a lawsuit again to ban Wi-Fi exposed in Israel. And while the question here is Wi-Fi safe, I felt that a little bit the discussion was not really focusing on Wi-Fi, and there's a lot more to be said about Wi-Fi. And I'll ask a question, but I'll make some word. I'll say some word before. What we do know about radiation is that it's not only the intensity which has an impact on the human body. There are other issues to be considered on whether or not radiation has biological effects. And I think this is extremely important in regard to Wi-Fi, because what we found out in our case preparation is that that modulation of Wi-Fi is especially dangerous to the human body. And we found, for example, and I read some of Professor Carpenter's papers on the topic, is Wi-Fi works on 2.45 gigahertz, which is the same frequency which was chosen for the microwave oven because of its high penetration to human tissue. And other things we found about Wi-Fi is that it uses technology which is called frequency hopping. It constantly changes frequency when it works. So essentially what it creates is an effect of pulsing on the human body, which is already established to be something more difficult for the nervous system to tolerate. Then we found out that the Wi-Fi uses a signal called a beacon signal. And the beacon signal is a signal that the Wi-Fi router constantly sending, basically asking if someone needs me. That signal uses 10 hertz frequency. And the 10 hertz frequency is one of the same frequency the brain uses. The alpha brain waves work on between 7 to 13 hertz. And so what we know from, I'm a communication officer in the Israeli army as well, and so we know that there's interference when two antennas or two transmitters using the same frequency, it's actually interfering with each other. So if you have a Wi-Fi router constantly sending a 10 hertz signal, and the brain uses the same signal, same frequency to operate, then there is a problem with it interfere with the operation of the brain. What we also found is that everyone who reported symptoms from EHS, not everyone, many people say that they react especially badly for Wi-Fi. And we actually suspect that that's one of the reasons, because it interferes with the way the brain works. Now, one more thing we found out is, while you guys talk about science, I found science to be obsolete. And you mentioned the issue of tobacco, and okay, so I will not make this point. The point is, can you expand on the issue of the modulation and other effects that modulation of radiation has, and not just intensity, on the human body, which makes Wi-Fi more dangerous?
It seems to me that you're offering a plausible explanation for some of the findings that we're beginning to see.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate you bringing that in.
And I would like to mention another point in that matter is that
I'm going to ask that we let somebody else have a little bit of our time.
My name is Jay Wenk. I live in Woodstock. By chance, I'm on the Woodstock Town Board, and I'm a World War II veteran, and because of the bona fides. My question was touched on indirectly, and I would like to ask it very directly now. What is the relationship between the capitalist state that we live in and public health?
They're inversely correlated. Thank you, Jay. We have time for one more question. Does somebody want to make a more direct response than that they're inversely correlated? The more you have a capitalist state, the less good public health you have. That's what my statement is.
Alex Lyons, Woodstock, New York. If there's a cancer cluster, and there was no cell tower before, and now there is one, to me, that's very strong evidence, and the fact that you hide behind this correlation thing when there's an obvious thing that just happened. If it was a crime scene, if there was a murder, you would have the cops running out. And the corporation should be held accountable just like the criminals. They're bad guys, they're poisoning the earth, they're poisoning people. And we don't need to wait. We can smell it, we can see it. It's toxic. It's showing evidence. We have evidence. This correlation thing, I think they're hiding, just like the FDA hides behind food and nanosilver curing Ebola and healing all kinds of diseases. They say, oh no, it's not proven to heal or cure any disease. That's just a lie. And the oil company is lying right now using toxic things that they shouldn't expose people to and rays they shouldn't expose people to. So if we have a choice not to, why not just say, whoops, we made a mistake, and flip the switch and do something else? So we figure it out. Not just experiment on the public without doing the test first.
Thank you. There are two more people around the corner. We're going to try to squeeze them in.
Hi, my name is Anthony Lee, and I'm in and out of Woodstock. But I just wanted to bring up a comment or respond to the woman's question on the CFC bulbs. I don't know if they actually do anything, but the LED light bulbs, when I turn one of those on, it actually causes interference on my radio right away.
Thank you.
My name is Barbara. I'm from this area. I wanted to know if any of you are familiar with lens neurofeedback. It's a treatment for people who have had brain injury, whether it's from an accident or stroke, where they find an area of the brain that's not working properly, and they take a very minute amount of radio waves and direct it towards that part of the brain. I wondered if you had heard about this treatment and what your what source place I could go for information about that.
I'm sorry, I don't know about that.
I believe there were some people in Stone Ridge that were using that technique, and so if you want to contact me at Catskill Mountain Keeper, I'll try to track that down for
I'm
you.
familiar with them, and they're having good results, but I wonder what the long-term effects are of taking radio waves and sending it towards specific parts of the brain.
I think it's a valid question and for another area for further study.
Okay, does anybody know of a place I could go to get more information about that?
You contact me later, I'll work with you on following up on that.
Terrific, thank you.
Thank you. We're multiplying behind the corner there. Okay, 2 more people.
Real quick question. My name's Eleanor. I'm from Raleigh. Do you know if direct current is better in terms of radiation than alternating current? The idea behind that would be if we were all on off-the-grid solar and maybe use direct current.
From what I understand of this, the answer is yes, direct current seems to be better than alternating current because it's a static field and there's not a lot of indication. I can ask these two gentlemen whether they can answer that, but I don't think there's a lot of indication in the literature that static fields are quite the same problem.
I agree with that.
Interesting, thank you. Our final questioner.
I'm Barbara Stemke from Kingston. I've been working, Weston and I have been working with the Public Safety Committee of the Kingston Common Council to get a moratorium on smart meters in Kingston. Do you have any suggestions for us to convince them that it's a good idea for a moratorium?
I think the best suggestion is to mobilize the population of Kingston to insist with their elected officials. I mean, we are a democracy, it sometimes doesn't work very well, but the only way we're going to change that kind of issue is by counteracting the power of the utilities and exercise the power of the people.
I think that's a wonderful note on which we can conclude. We wanted to add in, we neglected to thank earlier Jeff Herringfield, who has been handling the sound for us so expertly here. Thank you very much. Thank again all our panelists who traveled to come here and help educate us and inspire us. Thank you, everybody.